Inta.
Yes, alhamdulillah, yourself.
I'm good. My Arabic is enough to get me in trouble, by the way.
I'm the same. My Arabic isn't that good. I'm trying to learn, but my Kurdish is pretty good. So obviously I'm Kurdish Iraqi, so yeah, trying to learn.
Oh, we're having an earthquake.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
My house just shook. That was big.
Oh my God. Is that normal in San Fran?
I'm in LA.
Oh, in LA, sorry. Does that happen?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I haven't felt one like that big in a long time.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
That,
That's
that's pretty
crazy.
crazy.
Sets
Yeah.
the precedent for this conversation, doesn't it?
Right. Exactly. So a friend of mine just came over and is staying for a couple of days, and he's in the kitchen above here, and he's a personal trainer, and he's kind of a big guy, and I thought maybe he was just walking around really heavy, but everything shook.
Yeah, it's not just him falling over, is it?
No, no, not at all.
No,
You
I
know.
think it all looks good. I'm just bringing it back up.
Okay, sounds good. Well, who doesn't want balanced news? We all complain about the media, about how many of us can actually break down the language that we're reading and know when the headlines and the facts and the details are keeping us from the full picture or the truth, or even giving us the minimal amount of context. Well, we're about to meet one of the co founders of newscord.org, a new website that also has a big Instagram presence, and it uses AI to reveal media bias. I'm Hassan Jamal, and this is Arabs in Media. The growth of newscord.org and engagement on the stories they featured have been pretty astounding in just a few months. And once you see side by side comparisons of news coverage, you'll be forever tuned in to the language bias. You won't be able to unsee it. So today is almost going to be like a training of sorts, a consumer training to understand what's happening, but also some good news because our guest also has worked to get beyond the comparisons and deep dives into bias and news, but also to provide us, the everyday person like you or me, with the tools to call out media through the various levers available to us. So please welcome to Arabs in Media, Nima Akram.
Yes, thanks a lot, Hazem. Really happy to be here and to talk about media bias, which is a huge topic right now.
Thanks for joining us. So, first, let's just start off with how newscord.org got started. What was the impetus? Who was behind it? What was the light bulb moment? How did it start?
Yeah, so actually, this kind of all started post 7th of October. So obviously, Hamas started with attacking, going into Israel and attacking and killing, 1,200 Israelis. Obviously, I remember I was on the train sort of reading this, and obviously, you don't want any civilians to die, you don't want any innocent people to die. Of course, it's horrible. But the first thing that after that, I started thinking was, what's this going to mean for Gaza? Like, what's this going to mean for the innocent Palestinians? Like, obviously, what a lot of people probably didn't know, like kind of your everyday layperson in the UK and the US as well is there's a huge history here, spanning back from 1948, in the creation of Israel, how time and time again, there's been thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being killed, displaced. So, I knew the power and the kind of ruthlessness that Israel is known to have. So I was instantly worried about that and what it would mean for the people of Gaza. Um, and then kind of, obviously fast forward a few weeks and we're seeing, huge, bombings and massacres of hospitals and refugee camps in Gaza. And the number one thing that stuck out to me was the media bias, how the Western media was whitewashing it, was kind of brushing it under the carpet, using, several different like tactics to kind of desensitize us to what's really going on. And before we knew it, I don't know off the top of my head how quickly it got to 10,000 Palestinians being killed, but 10,000 became a normal number, and then 20,000, and obviously now we're at 40,000, and we've seen that the estimates are likely to be a lot more as well. But these it just became numbers, and it's really scary how desensitized everyone's become, of this genocide. So yeah, so like in I would say November. So a few weeks later, I kind of was made aware. Actually, my wife made me aware of this hackathon that a group called Dean Developers were running. So they're kind of like a group of, I guess the point of it is like a group of tech people that want to build stuff. And the theme of this hackathon in November was it was called Hack for Gaza. So it was kind of apply to be part of this hackathon if you've got a tech background and try to build something within a week that could help the people of Gaza. So as you can imagine, kind of rewinding to November, one of the big things that was kind of coming out was BDS. So boycotting was a big thing, and obviously, the likes of McDonald's and Starbucks, those were like the big things to avoid due to their involvement in funding the Israeli regime. So yeah, there were tons of like teams kind of thinking of ways they could maybe do some sort of facilitate boycotting. Like, it could be something as simple as like a Chrome extension that would work on top of your browsing and it would blur out any product that should be boycotted. So, some cool things came out of that. And myself with the co-founder Hugo and another friend, we kind of built Newscord, and it was if we look back, I wish I had screenshots of how it looked back then, but it was such a like simple, kind of rubbish, didn't really work, like a standalone web page, but the concept was there, and I think we kind of we were able to kind of explain the purpose of Newscord and why it was necessary. So I think definitely people were like kind of it resonated with them, and they thought that this is something that could really help drive like media literacy, media awareness against media bias. So yeah, that's how Newscord was born.
Do you remember any of the original headlines that made you really feel like this is egregious, this is really bad, like this is horrifying?
Yeah, so I think like in the beginning, I think Western media was definitely a lot less careful than they are now. I think too many people have called them out on their on their bias, and they have actually started to get a little bit better, or at least so that less people complain. But I remember like the Al Ahli hospital attack where 500 Palestinians were killed, and I think there were varying estimates where between 300 and 500, and it's like people were saying it's not 500, it's fake news, it's 300, like 300's any better, like 300 is a crazy amount of people dying in one attack. But anyway, like for me, what really annoyed me and moved me was the BBC. The BBC would say, in the headline, not attributing the attack to Israel, saying, Gaza hospital hit, reportedly 300 killed. There's so many things wrong with that headline. One, it's not attributing blame to the attacker. It's not saying who the attacker was, and it's reporting it as hearsay. So, we it's saying reportedly. So, that puts doubt into the reader's mind. So for me, the BBC doing that, a huge sort of facade went tumbling down, because obviously I grew up in the UK, and you get fed this time and time again growing up that BBC is impartial. It's not funded by anyone. It's kind of it doesn't have any shareholders. They kind of want to only report on the news in an unbiased way, and the way they were covering, and still to this day cover what's going on in Gaza is heartbreaking. It's absolutely ruthless, and it's only designed to like kind of whitewash what's really going on. So for me, that's what really like, that BBC specifically. That's what moved me to try to do something. And obviously, like to talk a bit about why me, why did I create Newscord? Ever since I kind of left school, I've been working as a data scientist, mainly for various different companies, and my role has always been, make more money for the business and, use the data, the customer data to try to drive more money for the business and make them more successful. But, when I saw this, I thought, what can I do? As, I felt so helpless, as I'm sure so many others did. What can I do to help Palestine? And I thought, I got data science in my locker. I know how to, build stuff. So why not try to combine, one thing that's really bad and try to solve it using the skills that I do have.
So that's one of the things that is interesting about newscord.org is that with people of a tech background who have gotten together, like yourself, to do good, one of your levers is artificial intelligence, which a lot of people are terrified by that term and those words because they think AI is going to take us over and, you know, it's, going to create all sorts of bad things in life. But the reality is that artificial intelligence has been in our day-to-day lives for many, many years. How do you use AI, explaining it in a way that the everyday person who is fearful of AI, how do you use AI to basically aggregate news to showcase the differences in coverage between different news platforms?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and yeah, so it's worth explaining what Newscord is and like how AI comes into it for the, I guess, for the listener that is probably thinking, why the heck are you talking about AI? So obviously, the recent boom in AI has come about from basically ChatGPT and what's called large language models. So these models kind of took AI to the next level in terms of like what it's capable of doing. It's pretty much able to have a full on conversation with you. It's able to cite, crawl the internet and get information for you. And even for like programmers, if you're struggling to build like a button on the website, you can just ask ChatGPT and it'll give you code. So it's kind of taking it to a whole new level in terms of like what's possible. And I'm sure, like, to be frank, like in the next probably decade, like the landscape of the kind of jobs that people do will change as a result of the presence of large language models. You can imagine, like, it's able to write full on kind of essays for students. Students are starting to cheat using ChatGPT. So you can imagine like the power it has, and how it comes into play with Newscord is essentially like Newscord, the website, it's a news comparison and aggregation platform at its core. So what it does is, for any story that's come out, so let's say the UK riots recently, it will find all of the articles talking about it from all of the different sources around the world, and it will start to, using AI, it will start to compare it. So literally the same technology as ChatGPT will be used to say, and it's kind of programmatically being asked, okay, what's the difference between the Telegraph article versus the BBC, or the Telegraph versus Al Jazeera? And then also what we do at the end of all of these comparisons is to distill it into one single article that is like kind of a amalgamation of like potentially 50, 80 sources. And the point of doing that is it kind of just gives you the full perspective. Like there'll be elements that one news source misses, or elements that one news source contradicts against another one on. And what New School does is it kind of has the summary, and then on the right hand side is kind of all of the differences and the difference types. So for example, it will say, okay, here's a paragraph about what the story is, but actually there's differences in narrative between Al Jazeera and BBC, or in some cases there's a contradiction between what the Telegraph is telling us and what the Guardian is telling us. So basically, like, without AI doing this so quickly and rapidly with thousands and thousands of articles, it just wouldn't be possible. Like, it would require the likes of yourself and myself and probably a whole army of people, like, plowing through these articles, reading them and trying to find differences. And that's kind of the beauty of like using AI with Newscord. And I sometimes say this and it's a bit cringe, but it's like using AI for good. Because there is a lot of possibly, unfortunately, there is the possibility of using it for bad. But I would say this is like using it for the good of humanity and to try to dispel something that plagues us right now, which is media bias.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned earlier about the BBC being egregious about it, I mean, everybody is a little bit of a product of their algorithm, right? If you could say that on social media, like if you start gravitating to certain types of content, that's what's going to be up in your feed. And I think one of the things that's so important about what I've read on Newscord has been that, it takes you out of your bubble a little bit, because you'll see how BBC compares to New York Times, compares to, the New York Post or the Telegraph or any of these sources. And the slides that you're referring to, so for example, if you go to the newscord.org page on Instagram, you'll be able to go through slides, seeing in the headlines these highlighted words and how the language is used. I always have joked that, the New York Times is the king of, violence broke out, in quotes, meaning what? Right. And I saw quite a bit of that when, attacks happened on pro-Palestinian encampments at University of California, Los Angeles. Strikingly, a few days later, the New York Times actually went through all of the video, which had they used AI, they probably would have been able to get through this pretty quickly. And I think it's really important to dispel the misinformation or the misdirection of information pretty quickly. And that's one of the benefits of this. It's like almost immediately you can see the things that you guys post as being, dissected into this is coverage that announced, the responsibility for the attacks within the headline, the number of children who were killed. I think these are important details and facts that a lot of times get lost out of the coverage that legacy media has been providing for decades and unchallenged. So, what's the reaction you've gotten by putting this content out?
Yeah, so I think like the number one thing is just people angry. Everyone's angered by this. At least the people that see our posts, and I think with Instagram there is an element of kind of being siphoned into kind of your own what's it called? I've lost the term now. Echo chamber. So you're like kind of in your own echo chamber, right? And you're kind of just preaching to the converted in some ways. But regardless, like we've reached millions of people now, and yeah, the number one thing is that people are angry. They're like, how can Western media do this? Like, people don't realize how subliminal and subtle their thing. So it is, I guess potentially making people realize just how subtle these things are. And I think that's what the part, that really is the power of comparison. Like you put two headlines side by side, it's super easy to then see the difference because like, it is possible to kind of, it goes over your head, right? You just read, for example, Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked and left to die. And you're like, oh, that sounds really bad. But there's so many, there are some key details in that. And that, by the way, that's a real BBC headline. There are some key details that have been left out in that headline. And, it will go over your head unless you see it compared side by side with, like, for example, a Middle East eye or headline. Um, so yeah, so the number one thing is people being angry, which actually kind of spurred us on to starting to have collaborators that are specialized in drafting up complaint letters against these news sources. So we've partnered up with the likes of Unmute Humanity and Accountable Media, who kind of are like kind of specialized in being able to know what is complaint worthy. Is this Telegraph headline really complaint worthy? Can we take it to the regulatory bodies and really get something actionable out of this? So I think ever since we've done that, that's kind of been a step change of what Newscord really serves as. It's not just kind of making you aware and making people angry, but actually now we can funnel that energy and that anger into something hopefully that is actionable. So people can kind of, there's a click to action or a call to action rather, to complain and lodge complaints. And actually an example of that being really successful is recently with this very BBC headline where with Mohammed Bahai when he was when kind of the IDF unleashed a dog onto him, and the BBC kind of whitewashed this in their headline. That kind of spurred over 1,000 complaints from our Instagram audience. So I would say that's truly a success story because if you're able to mobilize that many people and get them to complain, that's something that the BBC can't just simply ignore. They have to kind of acknowledge that this is a lot of complaints we're getting. We need to kind of say something or put out a statement. So we're yet to see one, but we'll see what happens.
Well, let's talk about that headline really quickly, if we could jump to that and tell the story really quickly about what actually happened. So this was a family that was sheltered in their home in Gaza City, and the IDF basically broke into their home, held this family hostage, and they sicked a dog, an attack dog, on one of the sons of the family. Now, this son had Down syndrome and I believe was also on the spectrum. So the developmental disabilities were clear and present. And I can only describe what I felt as the most evil cruelty I could imagine. in this scenario. Here's a family held at gunpoint, separated from their son who's being attacked viciously by an attack dog, with the military aggressively having this dog kill and maul a young man with Down syndrome. And the stories that I read, going into the different sources, recounted the tale of how it sounded like he was unable to even process what was happening, because he was, the quote from his mother was that he was telling the dog, enough Habibi, enough my love. Like, that's so hard to imagine. And if I missed any crucial detail on that, basically, from there, they kicked the family out, and when they were allowed to return to that home a week or 2 weeks later, they found him decomposed and mauled to death. And the BBC headline, if you can refresh us on that, was completely devoid of the reality of this.
Yeah, I think that was a really good way of explaining that story, because it is heartbreaking, and it's all too easy. Like, so much is going on and so many attacks and massacres are happening. Like, you kind of become desensitized to it. Even as, like, me as a person that's actually calling out the desensitization of from Western media, and caused by Western media. But actually, like, it does happen like so quick, because so much of it is happening. But the way you explained it, it is truly heartbreaking. There is nothing is off limits to the Israeli force. They will attack anyone and kill anyone in Gaza. And I think, they've proven that over the past 10 months and a bit. So the BBC headline, I'll read it out word for word, is Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, mother tells BBC. So, and actually, do you know what? That headline, if you just read it in isolation, it could potentially go over a lot of people's heads. Maybe not, people that are pro-Palestinian, that are already aware of this bias, but like, imagine your everyday lay person in the UK or the US kind of gets that notification, breaking news. They say, oh, that's really sad. Wow, like, I hope this conflict ends one day. That's probably what they're thinking, right? What is let's break this down bit by bit. What is a Gaza man? I've never heard that before. Have you ever heard of, London man or New York man? This language is almost like trying to wash away the Palestinian identity. Why can't you say Palestinian man? That is who they are, right? They're not. I'm not Gaza. I'm not a Gaza man. Let's say, I'm not a London man. I'm a British man, right? So it's as simple as that. And the next part is attacked by IDF dog. That's open to interpretation. Was the dog, did the dog go rogue? You always hear these stories. For a while, actually, in the UK, there was this big thing about, like, XL bully dogs being banned because they just kind of attack people and they're kind of out of control. Attacked by IDF dog is very possible to interpret that as, yeah, he was, the dog went rogue and started attacking Muhammad. What they really should have said is, after Israeli soldiers unleashed the dog on him, or something probably more succinct than that. But there's actually, I've made a post about this as well, is there's a good comparison to make with the Middle East Eye headline, which is Palestinian with Down syndrome left to die by Israeli soldiers after combat dog attack. So, that's kind of a lot more direct. It's saying, the Israeli soldiers went and kind of let the dog loose on him. It was an attack, basically, via their dog. And also, the last element of this BBC headline is, and left to die. Who left him to die? It doesn't, it's not clear that, the Israeli soldiers intentionally left him to die, a slow death. It's not clear at all from that headline. So yeah, that's just one example of how the BBC, and they're the masters of this. They truly are, of being so neutral, so tame in their headlines. Filled with hearsay, filled with generalism, that it just completely washes away the crime.
I think maybe we should do a side-by-side contest with BBC and New York Times on some of these. I saw a clip from a journalist, Abby Martin, yesterday, and she was talking about how the worst headline she had seen from New York Times was a few years ago, on how there were patrons in a cafe in Gaza and they were watching the World Cup, and there was an Israeli missile strike on them. And the New York Times headline was something akin to "finds its way to patrons in Gaza." Uh, it's really sick. It's a contortion of words and language to diminish the reality of what's happening.
Absolutely. And yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, like, I don't want to go into like conspiracy theory too much, but like these are professional journalists that have probably
Right.
got degrees in journalism. They know how to do a proper headline. So you've got to think, like, who is really controlling, who's the controlling party here, like who's on top of them, kind of telling them what not to say and what to say. Because I think it's beyond reasonable doubt that, like, they know how to write proper headlines, they know how to do proper journalism, but they are being prohibited from doing it or being controlled somehow. Probably a conversation for another day, but just to put it out there.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have conversations and to think about why things are the way they are. I mean, at the end of the day, when you have used AI to scour, thousands and thousands and thousands of real data, the data alone tells you that there is institutional bias when it comes to covering Palestinians and Palestine. And in fact, to your earlier point about what is a Gazan, for example, well, a Gazan, first and foremost, is a Palestinian. And this is a word that, depending on which media source you talk to, either denies is a reality that it even exists, or the extractions from that are banned. And another case in point is the famous New York Times memo that was positioned as a style guide for internal sources, for internal purposes only, on how they should write about things. But the New York Times, in fact, banned using the words ethnic cleansing, genocide, settlement, Palestinians, or Palestine, the country. And these are all biases. These are all legitimate to call bias. We all have some sort of bias or another, but it's important also to know that some of the most powerful and far-reaching media sources have a built-in bias that has this huge negative effect to the lives of Palestinians. Like,
Absolutely.
people have used the term "if words could kill." Well, words can kill when humanity is not seeing the impact of how language diminishes how we think as human beings, to really not keep something that's an atrocity or a genocide or an affront to humanity as a real situation that's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, that leads on to a really important element of this, and it's how big a part the media plays. How big is their role in actually enabling this genocide, or allowing it to happen. And actually, like, thank God for social media, because without that, I don't think, even 10% of the people that are marching, every week would be marching, down New York, down London, all over the world. Like, these people are truly moved by what they see online, and they're not having it, they're standing against it. And yeah, so thank God for social media, because without social media, imagine if all you had was, your traditional like TV channels, your BBCs, your ITVs, your Sky News, NBC. It absolutely whitewashes it. And one thing recently, one element that's really been added, and I think my interpretation of this anyway, is that Western media is starting to try to give off the effects that actually Israel is now being more precise, and they're targeting only Hamas command centers. And they kind of, when 20 people are killed in an attack, they don't report on it. If it reaches 100, they'll report on it, but then they will prominently display the IDF's claims that this was a Hamas command center. This school was actually a Hamas command center. They don't need to give proof. The Western media will perpetuate this anyway for them. So you can imagine, like, if we didn't have social media, that's all you're reading, and there's absolutely the potential for people to think, oh, you know what, fair enough, they need to get rid of Hamas, and let them carry on. Yeah, sure, there's civilian casualties, but it's par for the course when it comes to a war. But actually, we've seen that it's a lot more than that. And if I may, like, I wanted to talk about what happened over the weekend when a Israeli attack during Fajr, during a dawn Jama'ah, a congregation prayer, at a school of, which contained displaced Palestinians. I think 6,000 displaced Palestinians. This attack came, at that. The only thing precise about this attack was the time in which they did it. They knew when it was Fajr, we're going to attack them whilst they're all standing in prayer. And 100 people were killed so badly that there's heartbreaking stories out there, of doctors in the nearby hospital saying, there's a severed leg of the child, but in this leg there is the ears of another human and the nose of another human, and it's shocking stuff. It's heartbreaking. But then to see Western media then so quickly perpetuate the Israeli claim without even questioning it, that this was a Hamas command center. How can you even have that as your first paragraph? I'm seeing the likes of BBC, the likes of New York Times, The Guardian, which a lot of people think is really fair, but we've seen with how they covered Gaza is not actually that fair at all. How can they put in the first paragraph that IDF claims, and I'm not saying they passed it off as fact. They do say IDF claims that this is a Hamas command center, but how can you say that when there's the footage online of the human remains are put into plastic bags, and because the bodies are unidentifiable, you have to estimate that 70 kilograms of human remains equals one dead human. So that's how you do the death toll. How is that? How are those accounts from the doctor and these anecdotes not dominating the news? Why is it that they're focusing on the Israeli defense force or offense force claims? It's absolutely egregious.
Yeah, I was also wondering myself, how do you do this kind of work and not feel that you're crazy from the amount of gaslighting that goes on constantly when you read these sources? I mean, life, I'm sure, in so many different ways for people who have tried to reconcile how do I acknowledge a genocide used to be so much easier when, the Palestine issue, for example, was a can that was kicked down the road for so long. I think people forgot that this would be something to deal with at some point. And it's really unfortunate that, it was not dealt with through diplomacy, through negotiation, through peace, through, eliminating apartheid. But that said, one of the things that, affects many people that I know, that I talk with, people in, multiple communities, is that they get to a place where they're just worn down by, you could only call them lies. It's misinformation or disinformation, or it's directing you to think in a certain way when you see things happening. But for example, when you take the IDF or IOF position on something as being truth without questioning, which has been one of the major ills of journalism today, is that they take a government position, not just the Israeli government, a lot of times the American government or the British government, at, you know, truth and nothing but the truth without any question to it. But then if the Palestinian Health Ministry reports on 80 children being killed at a displacement camp, its position is hearsay because the Palestinian voice is not considered to be real or truthful. In some ways, like, the tool of Newscord is so needed because it makes you feel like, okay, I'm not crazy. Uh, this was gaslighting when I read this headline somewhere else, or it didn't occur to me when I first read about it. And I thought of the facts in my head as looking this way. But now that I see the videos and now that I see the side by side comparison, I'm completely, I can't unthink it. I can't unsee it. But thankfully, I mean, to get out of that place, you've created associations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like, Newscord selfishly has helped me, because I was going crazy. I was feeling helpless, and as I'm sure so many others were, just like, what is going on? I can't do anything about this. Like, I'm reading this BBC article, and it, like literally, as you say, like perfectly said, like, am I going crazy reading this because like it does not sound right, but you just don't have the time or the ability really to like sift through the different articles or the competing articles and try to find the differences in like a succinct way. And I think Newscord, the website, is enables that, and it enables me to do that and actually say, okay, I'm not going crazy, like Al Jazeera or Middle East Eye is saying something in a certain way which BBC is completely missing. And like just again about the massacre the during Fajr at the school, the AP, so these are all reputable sources, so-called reputable, Associated Press, The Guardian, BBC. The first paragraph of every single one of these three sources articles were talking about the IDF's justification for the attack. This was a Hamas and Islamic Jihad military facility. The Hamas command center was within the school. Instead of focusing on, for example, Anadolu Agency, which is a outlet based in Turkey, they kind of the first three paragraphs kind of quite nicely articulates how this was a place of displaced Palestinians, probably displaced for the seventh time or eighth time or 20th time. They have nowhere else to go. They're sheltering in a school. The Palestinians were worshipping during this time. They were waking up at 4 a.m. or I don't know what time Fajr is in Palestine, but probably around that time. Waking up at the crack of dawn to pray. You really paint the picture, and this is a practice in German journalism, right? You're telling a story, and the likes of the BBC are just intentionally like not doing that because um, because by the way, like what Anadolu Agency is doing is humanizing these people. It's treating them like humans, and these are people's lives that we're talking about. But the focus on like the so-called military operation, the so-called justification, is so tiring, and it does drive you crazy. And actually, well, thank God for the news called social media as well, because you're seeing all these people commenting and they're kind of echoing what you're thinking as well. It's actually a really good kind of validity check to say, okay, yeah, what I'm doing actually is purposeful and it does make sense. And actually, there is a purpose for this to be out there and make people aware of it. So definitely, like those are my coping mechanisms right now.
You're making me think of the importance of sharing so that when there is something that you've seen, if you're a consumer of News Cord on social media or from the website, that you share it with people who are outside your bubble. I mean, to me, it comes back down to like if people are products of their bubble or their algorithm. It's really important to get outside of that to and people can have their opinions, but facts are facts. And this is a data-based aggregation that would take scientists or teams of people or armies of people to do in the old days manually without AI. And so I encourage people who are checking out News Cord through whatever platform they're watching or listening to check out newscord.org and to check out the News Cord social account on Instagram, because sharing either through DMs or sending it as a text for people to see these language issues, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's important for people to see these distinctions. And I'll just add one thing in terms of conversations about journalists needing to do better. I've known a lot of journalists and news directors in my career from my, former career working in radio. And, they're good people. They're smart people. They worked in journalism. They got degrees on it. They understand the importance of checking sources. However, there are also biases of any organization that you work for. Go report on something unless they have a green light from ownership or management or their management or their senior news person or things like that. To kind of buck the trend internally, I think requires pressure. And that's where I think it's really interesting that you're connecting with a couple of different organizations to put pressure and to send a letter to different organizations. I will say that the US and the UK are a little bit different as I understand it. I don't want to sound like an expert on this, but can you explain how the complaint trigger works with the BBC or with British broadcast organizations if you're sending in something, what it means?
Yeah, again, I'm not actually an expert on this either, which is why I've got kind of the likes of accountable media and Unmute Humanity to help. But from what I understand, is there is like a certain threshold that needs to be met for the regulatory bodies in the UK, such as Ofcom, such as IPSO, to kind of investigate the complaints. And I don't want to get it wrong, but I think it's, and please don't quote me on this, anyone. I think 60 complaints is what it takes for Ofcom to then say, okay, we're going to investigate this. So, really, really and truly, that's not a lot of people to mobilize and encourage to complain. And luckily with the platform that we've built, we can easily start doing stuff like that. Obviously, we don't want to abuse that power. We want to kind of, for the headlines that are particularly egregious or the articles that are particularly biased, that's when we'll kind of have that call to action. But luckily we are in a place where we actually can try to hold these outlets accountable.
So the British approach is regulatory, it's governmental. And I would just say that in the US, it is important also when you are writing letters to find a way that's more effective. And I would just add that, writing the source, like I've seen a couple of the links that you've put up that send something to the Washington Post or to one of the other print publications with their digital coverage of what's going on, that and it's just thinking out loud. I mean, it's really in the U.S. It's kind of capitalism on steroids when it comes to news. I mean, news is a for-profit enterprise, and so really the advertisers are the ones who are very sensitive to complaints about particular kinds of coverage, and those have been the seismic shifts in American coverage or entertainment when there's a controversial event happening in news or entertainment where it's the advertisers when they bail, then the pressure ramps up because these networks are also facing a diminishing audience because they are going to other sources for their information. So I would say that what you're doing is really important. So let's tell the audience again, there are two associated organizations. One is Unmute Humanity, and the other one is Accountable Media. And you have both of those links up on the Instagram and website for
Yes.
Newscord.
Yeah.
And that helps you basically make comment or complaint to news organizations that have egregiously covered and dehumanized, the reality of what's happening in Gaza and Palestine.
Yes.
And the application for this, by the way, is for humanity, as I see it. To me, as a non-Palestinian, but as a human, seeing the work that is being done here and the purpose behind it, I greatly admire. So I really appreciate the work and the purpose behind it.
Thank you so much. It means a lot. Thanks. Appreciate that. Definitely.
All right. So,
Yeah.
okay, we're with Nima from Newscord.org, also on Instagram as Newscord, CORD. Please check it out. It's an amazing tool to help you distinguish fact from fiction. It really just extracts the bias in news coverage, particularly with regard to Gaza and Palestine. But these applications, I think, are limitless to benefit humanity. I appreciate the purpose behind this. We're having a really interesting conversation. So let's jump back into one of the stories that Newscord dissected in terms of the different ways that it was covered and the things that were left out and the importance of Hind Rajab. First, Hind was a story that was covered by a lot of mainstream media, and I think because of the human interest behind it and some of the analysis and assessment that I had done in a prior episode was about how because she was heard on a recording calling for help, talking to the Palestinian Red Crescent, and we'll break down the story a little bit, it became superhuman interest. And then the fact that the line went dead, and for 1 or 2 weeks, they were not able to find out what happened to her. It was kind of treated like this mystery or missing person type of event. So she was escaping Gaza with members of her family. Her mother went one way and put her in a car with other family members to go another way, thinking that that was the safest way to get to a safe place. An Israeli tank in the post-mortem of this was found to have killed the family members. In that process, she was able to take her cousin's phone and call a family member for help who got the Palestinian Red Crescent to call and try to get help out to her. They kept her on the they kept her on the phone for several hours. This young girl was scared. She's talking about how it was getting dark and she was getting scared. And when are you coming to help me? And in the meantime, the Palestinian Red Crescent was coordinating through a third party with the Israeli military her rescue with an actual ambulance from the Palestinian Red Crescent. She was then found a couple of weeks later, killed, along with the Red Crescent ambulance members just several feet from her who had also gone out to rescue her after the coordinates had been assured by the IDF that they could go there and get her. There was a post-analysis done on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that was she was killed by the car was strafed by 355 military bullets. So now that we're there with our understanding, let's talk about. By the way, Hind's story was what motivated many of the American college campus protests and the Columbia University coverage of that, which was hugely biased as well, where famously one of the CNN anchors talking about the unfolding event of Columbia University's protests when protesters took over Hamilton Hall and they unfurled a banner that said Hind Hall in her honor, in her memory, as inspiration for humanity changing this path that we've been on. They called her a woman who died in Gaza, not a 6-year-old girl who was mercilessly killed in Gaza. So that said, now let's talk about the coverage after the fact and things that you were able to discover.
Of the Hind Rajab and the story behind her is a representation of the tens of thousands of children that have been killed so far in Gaza. You've got to imagine, right, every single one of those people, it's not just a number, every single one of those children were innocent, like Hind Rajab. They were, they deserved a full life like we have here, but it was, evilly cut short by the Israeli aggression. And I think a lot of people have that takeaway as well. Hind Rajab is like kind of a representation of the tens of thousands that have been killed, the tens of thousands of children. So obviously, yeah, as you said, it was widely covered. Pretty much every news source has covered it. And it's almost like the Western mainstream media kind of coordinate on how they report on these and what the headlines say. So, for example, the BBC word for word verbatim says Hind Rajab 6, as in that's her age, found dead in Gaza days after phone calls for help. So found dead, I don't need to explain this to you, right? But I'll explain it anyway, just for completeness. Is she was killed by Israeli forces. I mean, that's obvious, right? That's clear. Like, she wasn't found dead. She didn't just kind of she wasn't just in the car for weeks and then ended up dying. Like that wasn't the case. CBC also it has a similar headline, very similar. Days after she called for help, girl's body found in car in Gaza City, relatives say. So, this is like hearsay upon hearsay without attributing any blame whatsoever to the attacker, namely Israel. And if you read the articles of these sources and what kind of the Newscord summary gives you on the website is that they're citing the requirement for further investigation before saying anything conclusive like Israel attacked and killed Hind Rajab. So they're saying, yeah, it's not clear what happened. That we need independent investigation. And a lot of like the world leaders echoed this statement as well. Said, we need we're calling on Israel to investigate this. and see what led to the death of Hind Rajab. A month later, it kind of, some investigations started being concluded. So some analysis came out, which was, really, really detailed analysis by forensic architecture, which kind of deduced that 335 bullets were fired into the car that Hind Rajab was in by an Israeli tank. And that this tank was only 13 to 23 meters away from the family car. So I mean, it doesn't get more deliberate than that, right? Like, you don't really read the lines to deduce that, okay, this was a deliberate attack. And by the way, they were in, the IDF were in constant communication with the Red Crescent ambulance, saying, this is where Hind Rajab is, we're coming now. And regardless of that, they were still, I think it was two ambulance workers were both killed. Um, so there's also another thing that came out of this, which was reported by The Intercept, and that was actually that the Red Crescent actually said that Israel never reached out to them about Hind Rajab's death, even though they claimed that, we're gonna. This is what Israel said. We're gonna reach out to Red Crescent to understand what happened. That never happened. They didn't ever reach out to the Red Crescent to investigate this. So we're seeing that, initially when Hind Rajab was quote unquote found dead, and cited the need for further investigation, that was covered globally. Pretty much every single news source covered this. But then months later, when investigations came out and some conclusive evidence was found, that did not get a peep at all. To this day, the likes of BBC, the likes of CNN, have not covered this whatsoever. So I think it's pretty clear they rely on recent like kind of short-term memory, and obviously that in this era that we're in, people do have short-term memory. They move on from things, and they they benefit from that, right? People kind of, they were upset, but then they moved on. And this, the Western media gets away with this, and our post and our call to action to complain against these sources is basically just reminding people, like, look, this happened, and actually, they're not following up on this. They're not, they reported the initial calls for investigation, but actually, when something conclusive comes out, they're not following up on that. And they're doing a huge disservice to the public by doing so.
Yeah, it's absolutely one of those things where again, you feel like, am I crazy? If this had been anybody else, they would be breaking apart the story from 100 different angles. They would be recreating it, but they had all the information available to them and just didn't even cover it. Similar to the school attack that killed 100 over the weekend. I think what's important is that the information is out there, and how it's presented is extremely key. But also, if it's not even covered at all, that should be another red flag for you as a consumer. And I think one of the benefits that you get from going into your website and seeing the news sources that Newscord is able to compare side by side is to also understand, hey, maybe I should be, breaking my algorithm a little bit and going to these other sources for news more consistently. If you have been just branded in terms of like, well, this is the newspaper of record, or this is the one that I've, got a subscription to, or this is where I've always tuned in, or what I've always watched or read, it would probably help you to open things up a little bit. Even if you don't agree with it, but to see that this is a real factual reality of what's happening out in the world, and it's, the power of covering it is meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, bang on. I think that's something that's really important is, there's the case of like biased narrative and contradictions and false information being spread by Western media, but then there's also equally, if not more, egregious is just completely missing stories now, and that's actually the bigger problem now, as we kind of enter the 10th month of the genocide, is you're seeing the likes of the BBC and CNN. Some days they don't report anything out of Gaza at all. So there is certainly like a blackout from the media right now on Gaza, and you could see that they're attempting to move on. Obviously, in the US, you've got the elections coming up. These are all opportunities for Western media to move on and to focus on something else. And ultimately, they're after the clicks, right? And if they're seeing that people, sadly and wrongly, are getting tired of what's going on in Gaza, then they're not getting their advertisement money, right? So they're gonna have to move on to the next thing. So yeah, and Newscord, actually, the website it does do that. Like, you can go on, it doesn't discriminate. Like, if Al Jazeera is reporting on something, it will appear on the homepage, and you can click it and you'll see all of the sources reporting on it. And what you will tend to see is that the major mainstream media outlets are no longer covering some of the daily developments that are going on in Gaza. So, for example, if like just today, I think at least 24 people have been killed in Gaza. You're not going to hear a peep of that from Western media. And in the beginning, it wasn't like that. In the beginning, they all had live feeds. I don't know if you remember, but like The Guardian, CNN, NBC, even Fox News, they had live feeds, reporting on everything that came out of Gaza. To be fair, The Guardian is still doing live feeds every day. Um, but yeah, they've stopped that now. The vast majority of them have stopped live reporting on Gaza. And yeah, it's really sad to see, but this is another like kind of purpose for New School that's coming out, that we're going to show you the things that most aren't talking about. So it very clearly tells you, 32 sorts. So I've literally just searched the earthquake that happened in LA, where you are, Hazm, and it says 32 sources have reported on this already. Magnitude 4.4 earthquake strikes Highland Park in Southern California. So it will tell you, okay, this is a big news piece. Everyone's reporting on this. So 30 is a big news piece, I would say anyway. For example, the 100 that were killed during Fajr prayer, that's got 100 news sources reporting on it. So that's basically global coverage. But then something like, if there's like, mainly when it's like overall in Gaza, if 20 people have been killed today over multiple strikes dotted around like Khan Yunis and other areas of Gaza, that won't get reported on. Now they just want to cherry pick the big ones, which is that's heartbreaking for me to even say those words. But yeah, that's the purpose that we're trying to serve.
Yeah, I mean, as human beings, we should all be outraged to the extent of like any of these happening. But one of the things that to me was just egregious was that 2,000-pound bombs were used to kill Palestinians in this last weekend's school killings. And that was supposedly the moral red line for the American administration on, oh, well, there's too much collateral human damage on that. Again, who's taking crazy pills here? Because how do you, deal with this constant hypocrisy in, foreign policy and media coverage of it? So let's talk about what's been going on in Britain, which to American audiences, not speaking for everybody, but like it's we have enough of our own drama here that we seem to be up against and trying to sort through fact from fiction. But then British society is often very mysterious to Americans. Like they can kind of understand a little bit of the drama or sitcoms that come out of there. And BBC, I think, has a brand name for news, ironically. And it obviously, not to paint it with the brush that all of it is bad or anything like that. We're just trying to identify the bias components to this. But that said, let's talk about what's been going on in Britain.
Yeah, so obviously it seems to have fizzled out now, but last week, or I think 2 weeks ago now, in Southport, in Liverpool, or in Merseyside, there was a teenager, a 17-year-old boy. He went and attacked stabbed three and killed three kids in three girls, children, in a Taylor Swift sort of dance rehearsal class. Obviously, really, really tragic. Horrible news. Absolutely crazy. How this boy did that at only 17. But then cue the misinformation cycle on social media. So I'm not going to say it was actual UK outlets saying this. It absolutely wasn't. It was more on Twitter, where this was being, spread like wildfire. They were saying, the man was an asylum seeker, he was a Muslim that did the killing, that killed the three girls. All of this was absolutely false, by the way, but the damage was already done, and it seemed like this for this group of people that ended up rioting, they were probably at their tipping point, and this was the one thing that's tipped them over. So even though it was misinformation, it was too late because after a day it was kind of debunked anyway. But they were already in riot mode, smashing up mosques, attacking hijabi women, attacking shopkeepers of ethnic minorities, which there are a lot of in the UK, attacking houses, pretty much just creating a completely Islamophobia fueled hatred against ethnic minorities. It was absolute racism that we were seeing in front of us. And what I will say about racism in the UK, I would say if you compare it to the US, it's probably a lot more subtle. It's more in the form of microaggressions. It's the kind of racism where if you had enough and you called it out, people would kind of gaslight you into thinking that you were going a bit crazy, and that it isn't racism and you're just looking into it too negatively. But obviously, this was, and I'm not going to say, all British or all like white English people are like this. Definitely not. But I would say it was a significant number of people. You saw the footage of these, racists rioting and harassing Muslims and ethnic minorities. So yeah, so I guess let's talk about the actual how that was covered by the media. And I would say like the vast majority of media, including the tabloids, did kind of call them rioters, call them racist, call them thugs, definitely like painted them in a bad picture. But what happened after a few days of the riots was that like there would be like kind of groups of Muslim men that would go out and kind of try to almost counter protest and try to like defend the mosques. And I think it's a natural reaction really. Like if Muslim women are being attacked, if your places of worship are being attacked, naturally you're going to be defensive and you're not want to go out and protect these people and these places. But unfortunately, what we saw was this is exactly what the UK media was waiting for, some sort of counter protesting activity to then kind of create a level playing field. What we saw from the BBC was the headline verbatim: clashes break out between rival groups after protest. So you can see as soon as there was the presence of counter protesters, now they can call it clashes. And absolutely, this is a false equivalency that they're drawing. And the same goes for the Telegraph. The Telegraph's headline is a bit worse, is far right and Muslims clash in fresh riots. And by the way, another key thing is the image that they use. So the main image, and this is the image of the thumbnail when you share it on WhatsApp and whatever. So, this image is important. This is what a lot of people will see. The main image was of these Muslim men in groups, kind of looking quite intimidating with, balaclavas and stuff. But you got to put this into context, right? Like for days now, they have been called, these racist rioters have been causing destruction across the country. They have been attacking mosques. They have been burning cars, and this is the picture they choose. And these are the headlines that they come out with, because a minority of, a small Muslim group, or, maybe it was sizable, let's say it was 100 Muslim men came out to counter protest. And this is the false equivalency they drew. And it works. As soon as this came out, you saw on Twitter or, everywhere they were saying, oh, why is the police not, doing anything about these counter protesters? Look at them, they're in big groups, causing mayhem. And then the term two-tier policing came in as well, saying you treat the racist one way and the Muslims another way, completely disregarding the fact that like these rioters are literally destroying shops, attacking people, and burning cars and attacking police as well. Um, so yeah, anyway, and also like to kind of zoom in on the BBC article, um, this is what it says verbatim: an anti-immigration protest began peacefully outside Bolton Town Hall earlier. So let me just pick that apart first. Anti-immigration protest, and maybe that in isolation was peaceful, but like, can you really say that? Can you really just kind of now completely lose the context of what's been going on the past few days and just say it was an anti-immigration protest, even though consistently for the past few days, these anti-immigration protests have just turned into outright racism and rioting. And then it says, but within half an hour, about 300 people, mostly had faces covered with black face masks or balaclavas, charged towards the building. So immediately, this is the BBC positioning the counter protesters as the antagonists, even though, it is clear, to us, the past few days have just been, pure, hate fueled racism, attacking against ethnic minorities. And you can imagine like how so many, millions, because the UK is a diverse country, and the London specifically, more than 50% are ethnic minorities. So you can imagine how such a large group of people were feeling for this week, like that, like they weren't wanted in the country. And then to just see this come out is, it's just the icing on the cake, isn't it? So yeah, so that's the kind of how the riots happened and how it was covered. And now to talk about the cause of it. And I don't want to pin the blame completely on UK media, to be fair, but I want to specifically call out the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, and the Telegraph. I don't know if are these sources that you'd be familiar with in the US.
Yes and no. I think the Daily Mail tends to maybe pop through a little bit more on maybe American awareness on that, but don't quote me on that. But I will say this, that anybody who has been to England, I mean, one of the things that people comment on when they come back is like, oh my God, British newspapers are crazy.
Yeah.
Like we see the headlines when you're walking by the candy stand or the cigar stand, and it just is a completely different reality in terms of how news is covered.
Yeah.
And for me, as a consumer who's been to the UK several times, I still struggle with what is quality, what is thoughtful, what is insightful, what is balanced journalism. Even if you have bias in there, like there's a liberal bias or a conservative bias, like what's the truth there? And we know in the US, I will say that like with Princess Diana, everybody understood that, there was a tabloid culture that wasn't about truth or a good society. It was about, getting people riled up for the benefit of selling more papers or more clicks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's safe to say that like these tabloids have now, completely lost their reputation as like a it's like a news source. People don't read, the Daily Mail to get their daily scoop. And actually, sadly, there will be a minority of people that do that, in fact. Um and that is just, simply put, quite sad. But yeah, to talk about how the UK riots, came to be, and how actually UK media contributed to this. I want to kind of quote some of these tabloid headlines. And actually, the Telegraph isn't classed as a tabloid. The Telegraph is meant to be a reputable, it's well known that they're a right-leaning source, but they are meant to be, within that sphere, quite reputable and certainly mainstream. So there's two comment pieces, or like opinion pieces, from the Telegraph. One being Islamists are bullying Britain into submission, and another one is Islamists and the woke left are uniting to topple the West. So like this isn't like a published piece, it's more of an opinion piece. But regardless, like the Telegraph is platforming these articles. And this has been going on, like these kind of headlines have been going on for months now. The Daily Mail, UK could be hit by a wave of homegrown jihadis if British Muslims are called anti-Semitic after Hamas terror attack on Israel. The Daily Express talking about the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan's past links to extremists are the basis of questions about his record as mayor. So, like, these are all highly, these are divisive headlines. These are headlines that are going to fuel hate within their readers, right? And um, you have to think, like, these contributed to people kind of reaching their tipping point and rioting. If all they're seeing from the news that they consume is headlines like that, then that can't have helped. And another element as well, actually, is how British media, and I've made a few posts about this, how British media have consistently covered the pro-Palestinian marches in London. And what they always do is they will, regardless of the hundreds of thousands that are protesting, they will find that one person that was arrested, and that will be the headline. So the Guardian, which is meant to be, people love the Guardian, right, in the UK, but actually, they've kind of shown their true colours, I would say. So the Guardian headline is four people arrested at pro-Palestinian march in London. Um, the Sun, I mean, I don't even know why I'm citing the Sun. They're already like their reputation's already in the bin. But extreme protest movements, Just Stop Oil and Palestine Action could be banned like terror groups. The Times. police, quoting Rishi Sunak, police must do more to halt protesters descend into mob rule. And this kind of goes into also how the politicians played a part in fueling this hate as well. Because absolutely, it was not just the UK media, it was the likes of Suella Braverman, the likes of Rishi Sunak, who were the people in the past government. So obviously, for those that don't know, the government just changed in the UK to a Labour one. But you can imagine, like for months and months, if there's that group of people that are highly susceptible to being riled up and getting angry and kind of already have racism within them, if they're just seeing these headlines, yeah, that's going to send them over the edge, isn't it? So, yeah, that's kind of like a breakdown of how the UK riots came to be.
Yeah, one part, sensational headlines, one part political irresponsibility, one part, society on the edge, looking for somebody to blame for their problems. It's the toxic mix.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And I should say, like, the link with the pro-Palestinian protest is like it probably creates it kind of that's where the whole two-tier policing came about. I think it's like, these guys are getting arrested, they're being violent, they have this false portrayal or this misconception of how the pro-Palestinian protests have gone, and they therefore feel like they're allowed to protest or to riot rather, and to be really aggressive and attack police and attack people because of this is the headlines they're seeing about the pro-Palestinian marches. And I don't know if you've been to any of the ones in the US, but like from the protests that I've been to, which has been quite a lot in London, every single one is just full of love and support, and people from all walks of life united against genocide. It's actually a really beautiful thing. So for me personally, it really hurts to see those headlines because they're kind of diminishing what the protests are really about.
We had our version of that in the States with the college protests
Absolutely, yeah.
a few months ago, where if you were to read just the headlines or the coverage, or even in depth read full articles, it wouldn't be until like the very end of the article that you would get a little bit of context or understanding. And most people are wired to just kind of, I think, read a headline and try to ingest the entire story because just time limitations or people are busy and they're just trying to get the gist of something. But that said, the college protests here made it sound like they were just these huge, violent mob scenes. And if you were to attend any of them, and if the media had done a responsible job of actually talking to people to find out what is your, mission, what is your feeling about what's happening, then you might have had a little bit of a different perception of what was happening. But we had a wildly different understanding of what was happening within those protests. But once you go to one, you're like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
people here don't like seeing babies blown up, and they think it's wrong, it should be stopped, and we shouldn't be funding it, and we shouldn't be supporting it with our tax dollars. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, it really is
It's
simple. And not to get into the college campus protest too much, but I think like a really high level and a really simple example of the media bias in the US for that period of time was how, the likes of Fox News and, that group of US media were consistently labeling the protesters and the students as anti-Israeli instead of pro-Palestinian. This is just a really basic example of how like the words can have such a different words can completely transform how people perceive something to be. Anti-Israeli sounds negative. It sounds like you're against something. Pro-Palestinian is kind of pro a group. You want a group to succeed and you want them to survive. So just simple differences in wording make such a huge difference. But yeah, that's just one example.
Isn't it ironic that uh, when we are making the argument that words matter, people are like, no, 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 these are trusted sources. You're being oversensitive. This is the reality on the ground. These are the kings of coverage. And then when they indeed go cover something, they'll start, calling them anti-Israeli instead of pro-Palestinian. And it's like, I think we can all see that when we are awake to it, but to kind of constantly be in this battle of you know defending humanity, it's being made a little bit more serious these days. To your point at the top of the podcast, that I think they're working harder to make sure that the wording isn't so egregious anymore. But we need to be very aware and check multiple sources and to have conversations with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I would actually
This,
like to shout out one person. I don't know if you're aware of her work, Asal Rad. She's, I would say, single-handedly done an amazing job of like probably holding the likes of New York Times accountable for the headlines. Like I feel like, and I might be wrong here, but I feel like there's a very tight correlation between her calling out the headlines from these Western outlets such as New York Times and them fix it, like pulling up their socks and fixing their acts a little bit and starting to like, for example, call out Israel in the headline. So I feel like she's like always been on top of it and calling them out. So she's done an amazing job. But yeah, like these types of things I think are so necessary in trying to change the tide. And I would think that they would never directly tell you and say, "Yeah, look, because of Newscord or because of Asal Rad, we're now changing direction and we're going to be a lot fairer in our headlines now." But hopefully, we do see it. Like ultimately, we don't want the recognition for it. We just want to see it happen, right? So yeah, inshallah, one day we'll see.
well, we're going to put Asal's social links in the subtext of our podcast information so that you can find that information as well and follow Asal, but also follow newscord.org and also follow them on Instagram at newscord.org and or is it at
Underscore
newscord
underscore.
underscore.org. Once you put newscord in, hopefully you're not shadow banned
Yeah,
and people
exactly.
will
Yeah,
be
hopefully
able
we
to
come
find
up.
it.
Yeah,
That's another issue. That's more episodes to talk
that's
about
a
shadow banning and how big tech
yeah.
works.
I'm gonna have to come back for that one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Nima, it's been a true pleasure having you talk about these really important issues about how Palestine is covered and the built-in bias in news media. Go to newscord.org, sign up for updates, and be ready when the app is ready. And if you want to also subscribe to Arabs in Media on the Substack platform or wherever you listen to podcasts, we'll have an update there once any developments come together with that. I'd love to have you on again.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
It's been great. So, from across the pond, as they say, from the States to the UK, let's see if we can come up with something that'll be like a slogan. We will hold the media accountable. I'm sorry, it doesn't rhyme. It doesn't rhyme.
Yeah, across the pond. Yeah. From both sides of the pond, we hold the media accountable. I don't know,
There we
something
go.
lame.
All right. Nima Akram from newscord.org. Thank you again for being a guest on Arabs in Media, and we hope to have you on again very soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.